right, welcome to How to Be a Dungeon Master. I am so excited, joined by one of my most favorite people ever, Eugenio Vargas, aka DM Jazzy Hands. How was that? Did you like that?
You nailed it.
Yes.
And for what it's worth, the feeling is mutual about the favoritist people.
Oh, I know. Like you,
it's been so long.
It's been forever since we've actually seen each other, but I was just, reminiscing this morning, knowing that this interview was coming, thinking about how we met, and I put that in quotes because we were just social media friends, I think, on Twitter, and it was because we were both really bitter and angry and suffering from FOMO from D&D Live, because we were like the only two people who weren't there.
Yeah, the only two ones in the whole world. It was just a travesty.
It was. And I think we even just tried to make it seem like it was cooler to not be there or something.
We did. We had our not going party.
That's right.
I recall. This was way back.
Yeah.
This was whatever the one was at Meltdown, I think.
I think it was one of it was either the first or second one. It was way back. And then we finally got to meet in person.
At Origins years ago now.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then we at a D&D Live, the last one that was in person, we got to hang out. So it's just, when you just see someone's, I don't know, their little avatar on social media, sometimes something in your heart just flutters and you're like, that person's going to give me dungeon mastering advice one day. I know it. And that
is what I can do.
Because you come from a theater background.
I do.
I think what we are going to talk about today is something that is very inherent to talented theater people, I say, because I'm also from a theater background and this is not in my wheelhouse. But this is the old yes and that we hear a lot about from improv, and a lot of dungeon masters talk about it. And it makes my heart tighten up a lot when I think about it, because what you are saying is actually a good thing, and a good creative outlet is the thing that scares the crap out of me the most. And that is players not doing what you think they're going to do, or as you said, and I will quote you, using player shenanigans in the moment they occur to be more creative, and using the yes and philosophy to keep your games going, to propel the content and the overall narrative without completely losing control.
Yeah.
The hell?
Yeah. So yes, and like you said, comes from improv, and it's, I will say, for anyone that is familiar with it in improv, it's not exactly the same, right? In improv, the idea is you're doing a scene, and if someone comes in and says, "My, what a lovely day we're having," and you're like, "No, it isn't," well, that's okay. That's sort of it. That's the end of the scene, right? So in improv, it's right, exactly. In improv, right, you say yes all the time to everything, because that's how funny and interesting and full scenes are created between multiple people, right, that are making it up in the moment. In D&D, for a DM, I want to be very clear. I am not saying, nor would I ever say, that you should say yes to everything your players ever ask for.
No.
Because that will go off the rails very quickly, right? But what I think a lot of DMs are nervous about when it comes to yes-anding, when it comes to players making unexpected choices or asking unexpected questions, there's sort of a worry that if you don't answer correctly as a DM, if you don't give them, the option that you were expecting, the campaign, the story, the narrative is somehow going to break in that moment. You're going to break it by saying the wrong thing. And I hope we can chat about this in a way that everyone will realize that actually I think your stories and your campaigns and your games can take a lot more than you think they can outside of the box that you come in with from your game prep. So I wanted to ask you to start off, let's come up with a situation, right, that makes you squirm, right?
I'm already squirming. Well, I'm being put on the spot. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, but just so we can even use your standby story, right? You had a group of players, as I recall, and you had ready what was going to happen to the left, and they decided to go right. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So tell me, what was in your brain, what was so scary about that moment?
I didn't know in that moment, I didn't know, just they don't know what direction this is.
Sure.
Just move it to the left. It just felt like they were going on a different story path than I was prepared to tell as the dungeon master.
Totally. So let's now, with the ability of hindsight, right? You knew what sort of the end goal of that dungeon or wherever they were. Like, you knew what they were trying to do there, yeah?
Yeah.
In the end, I think what makes us scared is that we are worried that our players aren't going to get to where we're trying to get them. We're not going to get to that major plot point. They're not going to find the item that they're looking for. They're not going to meet up with the big bad guy that they're worried about, right? That the story is somehow going to not end in the right place. Does that feel at least kind of right?
Yes. So much so.
Cool. Let's take any of the published D&D adventures as an example. Curse of Strahd, right?
Okay.
In theory, Curse of Strahd is going to end with a confrontation with Strahd, probably, in some way, yeah? Cool. Yeah. Curse of Strahd itself has a bazillion different ways to get to that end point, yeah?
Yes.
Who's to say there couldn't be a bazillion and one? Do you know what that bazillion and first way is right in this moment? No, maybe not. But if that story can have a bazillion ways to get from A to Z, I bet it can take one more without breaking. So let's go back to they went left instead of right.
Okay.
You've got to get them to find the item at the end of this dungeon. They went right. You wanted them to go left. Sure. The easy answer is move what was to the left over to the right and continue on. But maybe there's something exciting and surprising to the right. And maybe the story does go off track a little bit, but you know where they need to end up, yeah?
Yeah. But I think
so you can get them back there.
The story being surprising is exciting to a player. But as a new dungeon master, it's like, I don't want any surprises. So
Absolutely.
And I think, like, I've really blocked this out because it was just that traumatizing.
And I'm sorry to keep bringing it up.
No, I bring it up too, but I was trying to think, like, what were they trying to do? Because when you bring up a good point about, like, you need them to do this one thing. Is that what the fear is, that they're just not going to do it? And I remember the adventure had something to do with, like, they had to rescue puppies.
Of course it did, first of all.
And that there was, like, a very bad person that was, doing terrible things to these puppies. So I think I probably did something like, you can hear, like, whimpering coming from, like, behind this door. And assuming, like, they're obviously going to go break down the door, and then my adventure starts. And they were like, okay, well, we're going to, like, walk around town or something. Like, oh, you are? Like, so I don't, like, how could you have taken that and, like, been like, okay, cool, now we're going to do this.
So, okay, this is great. So they need to rescue some puppies. The puppies are on the other side of this door, and they go explore the town.
Yes.
Cool. What else could draw them to the town that you hadn't planned on? Now, I know this is difficult, and I'm not saying this is an easy thing, right? This is not, the most basic of DM advice. I'm willing to admit that, absolutely. But I don't think it's as hard as we think it is. So let's think about this situation. So they went out and explored the town. Well, where did the puppies come from?
And I don't remember. I think they were like a puppy mill. I think they were being bred for,
Great. So if they're going to explore the town, somebody in town maybe knows about the puppy mill, or maybe they had one of the puppies, or maybe they... any number of people that they could run into who might know something about the puppies. Let's step back even further, though, because this is something that you opened with, right? Using their own shenanigans. You made it very clear you wanted to go through this door. They decided to go elsewhere.
Right.
There's a reason, right? And if you can be there with your players and sort of figure out, like, okay, why did they ignore that? Was it just to, like, be a jerk to me as the DM, or was there something else that they were going for? And maybe, look, that's a whole other conversation. But maybe there was something that they were doing. So ask them, right? Part of the yes and is literally just saying to them, okay, and so where are you going? What are you looking for? Ask these questions. Let them come up with it. Right? That's the beauty of an improv scene. If we take this back to what it's like to do an improv scene, I I, as one of the actors in the scene, am not responsible for the whole scene. That would actually be very, very boring for the other person.
That's really interesting too. Like, you know what? I love doing these segments because I feel like there's always like several moments that are like, boing, like a light bulb. Like, oh yeah, it's not up to me to just, they went left. Tell me why you went left. You're right.
Absolutely.
Why can't I ask them questions?
And that is a form of yes-anding, right? The yes part is accepting and saying, okay, you went to the right, you went into town. And the and part is why? What are you looking for? Or even if this is the type of relationship you have with your players and the type of game you're playing, even going so far as to say, okay, and what's in the town? What is the first thing that you see there?
Okay, that's really interesting and good and enlightening because I think part of my problem was I know this, I have a story. Mm-hmm. The story starts here when you open the door. Mm-hmm. Now you have gone away from the door and now I am panicking because I don't feel like I have a story. But I did still have a story. Like it's not just my cross to bear. Like,
exactly, absolutely.
And players want that agency too. I'm like, you want to be part of that story. So yes, I should have just asked them why.
Well, and it seems obvious, but it really isn't. And there's a couple of reasons for that, right? For a lot of folks, and I am moving away from your specific situation because I don't want to speak to that experience specifically for you. But a lot of us, myself included, honestly, come to D&D from video games, right? We're doing it sort of in the opposite direction. Whereas the reality is D&D sort of set the structure up for video game RPGs in a big way. A lot of us experience them the other way around. And so when we come to a tabletop game from a video game, we have in our mind that there is a line from A to B, and there might be side quests, but that line is what it is, right? But we are much more creative creatures than that. And that's what's fun about tabletop games as opposed to video games. So that's number one. The other one is there is sort of a philosophy of role playing that I totally understand. I don't run my games this way, but it is completely valid that if you're going to create a sort of a level of, I don't want to say realism because we have magic and elves and as of like, so not realism, but like a level of consistency in the world building, let's say. There's this feeling that like, well, if the city exists, if the city of Waterdeep exists, for example, I just can't decide to add in a building that, you know, doesn't really quote unquote exist in Waterdeep. Sure you can. Why not? Right. Or if your players want to add, you know, if they're looking for a tourist center in Waterdeep, I'm pretty sure, you know, there in none of the published works about Waterdeep, not as far as I've ever seen, is there a tourist bureau. Why can't there be one? What do you want to, you know, what do you want to find out at this tourist bureau? Well, I'm looking for a map. Yeah, there's a big case of you know, map brochures on the table. I didn't know that was the case. The players didn't know that was the case, but it served in that little moment the bigger story. It made them happy because they felt some agency and some creative license within the story, and then you go from there.
Do you ever have you ever been in an experience where you've kind of just like, okay, let's, you know, see where this goes, and like, what if it just doesn't go? Like, how do you get out of that?
Yeah, so that's tough. So I think there's sort of an escalating sort of series of things you can do to try and get them back on track. And I will say that at some point, I don't think it is unreasonable for a DM to turn to their players and say, hey, we're all sitting down and playing this game together. I want to give you all the freedom to have fun and explore as you want. But if you want me to run this game and tell this story with you, I'm going to need you to a little bit get on board with what's going here, right? That's sort of the last resort, okay. But I don't think that's a bad thing for you to have to do. But how do we avoid getting there? You know, like I said, the big beats of the story. There's a puppy mill. They've been taking these puppies. They're mistreating them, and the adventurers have to save them. And in doing so, they're going to overturn this puppy mill corporation. Okay. So if they're going off and looking at things, you keep dropping in bits about that. They meet an employee of the Puppy Mill Corporation. They meet someone who got their dog from the puppy mill. They meet someone who lost their dog to the puppy mill. You just pepper in these things to give them little, let's go back, let's go back. And they don't have to be deeply planned out, right? Because you know the important things. The only important things are there exists a puppy mill, it is bad, and we are trying to stop it.
Yes.
You know, if you're creating NPCs in the moment that know something about that puppy mill to try and get the party back on track, okay, now you've got an NPC that knows something about the puppy mill. That doesn't change the important beats of the story, right?
Yes.
Does that sort of make sense? Is that sort of helpful?
Like, so much so that I kind of want to go back and play this adventure. Because now I'm thinking, okay, if they just, they heard the whimpering, they left, they went around town, like I could have just made them hear whimpering again. And like, they could have just kept hearing the dogs until eventually they were like, oh, this isn't normal. These are not normal dog sounds. We must go.
Yeah. I realized that I pitched this conversation to you as like a lesson on yes and, but as we're chatting, I'm realizing that it's actually about like letting your players know that like they have agency in this too. They can help you tell the story.
Yeah.
But with that comes the responsibility of being willing to be a part of the story that you as the DM have come to the table with, right? It's way less scary to ask your players, why do you want to go here? What are you looking for? If you know that they're going to work with you, right? That's an important thing too.
It is.
That's an important thing too.
But it's important, like, I think like dungeon masters, like new dungeon masters or people who are thinking about dungeon mastering have definitely heard people say yes and in association with dungeon mastering. And probably a lot of them are like, I don't know what that means, or it sounds intimidating. And I guess there's a question about like how would you even, well, I guess how do you prep for if you don't know where the story's going to take you, if you're going to employ the yes and technique?
Absolutely. So for me, my prep almost always centers around, if it's pre-campaign or during the campaign, knowing what things have to be a part of my story to tell the story that I want to tell. And there are almost always half as many of those things as you originally think.
Okay.
So like I said, there were all of these things I'm sure that you prepped in this journey to get the dogs.
So many.
But what was important? That there were dogs.
Yes.
And that they needed rescuing.
And there was
right? And maybe villain. You had there was a villain, right? And you created this villain.
Yes.
That's it. Right? You can prep way more than that. You can prep the layout of the dungeon. You can get, and probably should get stat blocks and have, NPC names and that. But ultimately, the story that you're telling is that there are puppies and a bad person is keeping them and you want to free them. And the rest is fun, collaborative storytelling. If the players want there to be, another example of this, right? The players are bound and determined to, as they're searching for these dogs, find some trace of them. That wasn't the way you'd planned this. You were only working on like auditory things, right? They can hear the dogs. But maybe like I'm playing in a campaign right now where one of my players is a Loxodon. And so they get advantage on perception checks that deal with smell. So all the time that player is saying, well, is there a smell associated? Is there a smell associated?
Oh.
Let me tell you right now, Shelley, I have never planned for there to be a smell associated in any way, shape, or form in this adventure. But that's the character they created. That's their bliss. That's their fun. So yeah, now there's a smell. Maybe one of the dogs is wet, and so there's a wet dog smell, right?
Yeah.
And that player gets that thing, right? It's just, there are infinite possibilities. And if you prep the things that are absolutely core to the story, and then you go back through that list and you remove half of the things on that list, right? Because I bet half of them aren't core to the story. Then you know for sure, well, I can make up 6 different ways that these players can get on the trail of these puppies, and they'll all lead to that room with that villain and that fight.
Okay, that makes sense.
I think it's, I am discovering all sorts of things as we talk about this.
Good.
And I'm gonna say this in a way that like is perhaps a bit blunt, but I think we as DMs, I think it serves us really well to be less precious about our stories.
Yeah. I think you have to be.
I think you have to be, and I think it's more fun. Look, that's my opinion. If you want to run a story where things have to happen A, B, C in alphabetical order from A to Z, and that's the type of game that your players are into, that's great. That's a lot of work and a lot of pressure, in my opinion. And for the types of games that I run, and I think the types of games that are getting a lot of sort of attention, whether it's through streams or just like chatter on Twitter and the internet, the types of D&D campaigns that are sort of interesting to people and in the zeitgeist right now are collaborative storytelling.
Yeah.
And that means you have to give some of that up to your players. And that means that giving that up to your players isn't going to break it. It's a feature, not a bug.
Right. Yes. But okay, so what if you have players that maybe aren't as comfortable with role playing and storytelling, and like how are there ways that you can employ this kind of tactic and philosophy without scaring them away?
My go-to for players that are nervous about really, honestly, just about any part of D&D, whether it's the stats or the dice or the storytelling and the role playing, is just to ask questions, right? Because a lot of times a good chunk of their nervousness is that they don't know what they need to know, or they don't know what they're allowed to do, or they don't know what they can do, whether it's in terms of the rules of the game or what they can do with you as a DM. So questions. We want to go right. Okay, cool. Why? We want to go into this house. Great. What are you looking for?
Okay.
We want to sniff around. What kind of smells are you looking for, right? Questions. And the other thing is, if you have a player that just says, well, I want to go in this house, and you say, why? And they say, well, I just want to go in the house. That actually is great for you, because that means you get to decide, right? If they don't have a real specific thing in mind, they're just doing a thing because my character is chaotic in this moment. Okay, so am I as the DM. Great. The other thing I will say is I hear myself saying things like, just make it up, come up with this thing in this moment. And I recognize that is not easy for everyone. And I recognize that is stressful sometimes, because there is this pressure that what you say as the DM suddenly becomes canon for this world. And maybe you're not that type of creative. Maybe you're not that spur of the moment type of creative in a lot of ways. That's okay. Practice and remember always, it's a game that you're playing with your friends to tell some goofy fantasy story, right? Maybe it's a serious fantasy story, whatever your type of story is, but it's a game that you're playing with friends to tell a story. If you screw up, okay, I made up a thing. It actually didn't make any sense. That's okay. You can either say to the players, hey, let's go back and I actually want to change this a little, or say to your players, this is a weird thing. I said it and I kind of regret it. Help me figure out how to make it work.
Oh, yeah.
And believe me, I've done that. Ask my players on the Last Refuge. There have been times where, and some of them we've kept in the recordings and some of them we haven't because they go on. But there have been times where I'm like, oh, I screwed up. I should not have allowed that. I shouldn't have said that. I described this wrong. Let's figure out how to make it work, right? Because I don't want to penalize you all for me like getting excited about a thing. And they understood that. I would hope that anyone that you are sitting down to play a game with would be willing to have that little moment with you as a DM.
I would hope so. And if they're not, then maybe those aren't people that you want to play with.
I mean, that's sort of my feeling. And, I never want to tell somebody they're playing any of these games wrong. But like, I do think that if you're afraid of your players, like getting upset with you because you messed up, that doesn't seem like a fun table.
There's a different type of dungeon master that they may thrive with. It probably won't be me.
Right, or me.
No, or a lot of people. But there are DMs for those tables as
absolutely,
well.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that is valid and that is fine. And that is a very different sort of philosophy that requires different prep and different skills in the moment. And that's great, but that's not what I'm here to talk about.
That's not me either.
Right, exactly.
I should have called it out when you said it earlier, because now I can't remember what we were talking about. But you said, this is a type of yes and. or this falls under. And I think that was an important call out because, again, I'm going back to like the newer dungeon masters and the yes and philosophy. It's not a literal yes and, but it's an umbrella, and under the umbrella there are different types of things that would fall under this philosophy. Are there other like little tips and tricks under the yes and umbrella that you think would benefit a new or inexperienced dungeon, or really any dungeon master? But
absolutely. One of the things that I find in the sort of yes and category that I've really had a good time, and I asked some of my players before I sent you this topic, like, what are some things, here's a narcissistic question, what am I good at? But like I did, because I was curious what made an impact on them. And one of the things that several people told me they really enjoyed that I do is one of my yes and techniques is to say, okay, let's find out and roll some dice. That's right. We're playing D&D. We roll dice. It's part of the fun. I think most people who play D&D enjoy the math rocks, right? In some way.
The math rocks.
So yes and yes and with the dice can be a bunch of different things. It can be come up with an ability check that you want them to do. You know, I want to go to the right because I think maybe the barking sounds are a red herring and I bet they're over here.
Oh,
okay, make a perception check and see what you find. And if they fail miserably, then you can be like, well, actually, you know, that in that direction, it is all darkness. You can't see anything at all, right? Or if they succeed spectacularly, you can be like, well, in that direction, you smell the lovely smell of horses, which is not the animal that you are looking for. Probably don't want to go that way, right? Let the dice help you with this storytelling. And a failed check is as interesting as a successful one. But the dice can both help you figure out as the DM what is going to happen, and also give you a moment to breathe while that player rolls dice and does math and gives you the total, right? It gives you that 10 seconds to come up with something.
Yes.
We want to climb this mountain, even though I, the DM, just spent 10 minutes describing the very simple, easy looking path that you can walk up this mountain, but we want to climb it. Okay, there were 3 encounters and some important details that were on the path, but you want to climb it. Okay, make me an athletics check. You fail miserably. Well, I guess you're not climbing this mountain.
Oh, are they failing miserably because you've made it, it's just, you know, that they're never going to succeed at it? Or did you fail them on purpose, or what?
I never fail on purpose because I do, and this is not rules as written, but I do allow for crits in ability checks, which... that the more I do that, the more I feel like that's like expert level DM, because your players will always crit at the worst moment. But yeah, maybe if I really don't want him going up that way, maybe that DC is going to be, it's a very smooth cliff face. So maybe the DC is going to be like somewhere between 17 and 20. And then if they succeed, okay, you took the time while they were doing that, you had a moment to figure it out. And so they're climbing, and you're going to say, well, okay, now I realize that they can see the old man who was the original founder of the puppy mill, who was pushed out of the company. They can see him because they're climbing up and they can see him in the distance, even though they're not going to meet him on the road. Right. But I had a moment to figure that out while my players were, getting out their climbing kits and trying to figure out how they were going to rope each other together so they don't fall, because players are always worried about that kind of thing.
Right.
Don't rope each other together, then you're just all going to fall. Anyway, sorry.
So much pressure, but not. But not.
You know what? I also do. Speaking of yes-anding with the dice, I also will sometimes just roll a percentile and say in my head, like, we're looking for an elf in this town who knows this particular history. Well, I had a journal that you were supposed to find in the dungeon. You were supposed to talk to an NPC about it, but okay, sure. There's a 25% chance that somebody knows something. Roll percentile.
Oh.
Use the dice. If 75% chance that you're going to be able to tell them no, you still yes-anded them because you gave them a chance, right? Yes. I still think that's yes-anding, but 75% chance they're not going to. And if they roll in the 25%, well, okay, then you can say, great. Give me a second and I will let you know what you found out, right?
Maybe that NPC has the journal. I don't know. Like there's...
Exactly that. Why does the journal have to be in the dungeon? The NPC has the journal.
You could hand it to them. If it's that important to the story, the NPC can just, do you see what I did?
You just
I rolled with it.
And you also did something else that I think is important, is that you acknowledged if the journal is that important. Did the journal really make it onto your list of like must-haves for this story? Yeah. I bet it doesn't. I bet the info in that journal is just as easily given verbally by an NPC. Now, maybe you are a crafty DM and you made that journal to show and you have all these things. Well, then yes, the journal is that important. And so you do what you said. You give the NPC the journal. Okay, it's a family heirloom.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
The yes and it's a spectrum, and you can use it on all kinds of scales, right? We want to go to the elemental plane of air. Okay, sure, yes. Why is my and, right? That's a huge scale yes and. I want to try and use Thorn Whip to grab my party member who's falling off a cliff and yank them back to safety. Not really an intended use of that spell, but I don't see why not. Sure, go ahead, roll it up. Yeah. Those are both yes and, right? And they can both of those moments can feel scary to a DM that is not ready for the unexpected suggestion, whether it's go to the plane of air or use Thorn Whip to catch a falling artifact, right? But both of them can be yes-anded.
Yeah. And it's a nice way to reward your players' creativity and to keep them, and to, there's potential new story hooks that come out of these things too.
Absolutely. And suddenly you're going to find yourself, figuring out ways to integrate your characters' backstories that you hadn't thought of in that moment, because those players know their characters' backstories. So maybe the reason they went to the right is because, this is a silly example, but maybe the reason they went to the right is because they are, the D&D equivalent of Derek Zoolander, and they can't turn left. And you didn't know that. Okay, well then when you say, okay, why are you going to the right? And they tell you that, now you have all of this fodder, right? To put fun things to the left and watch them problem solve it, right? There are all kinds of things you're going to learn if you just let your players be as creative as you, ask questions, and rest assured that as long as we're still talking about puppies and a bad person that is holding them captive, your story is probably not going to break.
Oh. So again, what I learn is the players are not your enemies. They're not there. They're not there to find ways to break your story. They use them for good, use them for inspiration, use them to help you tell the story.
Yeah.
And again, I'm inspired.
I'm so glad. I am.
And
it takes practice. It does take practice, right? Because if you have that fear of the yes and, you're going to have to push through it, and that's tough, and that's going to take a few times, and I get that, and that's okay. And again, you want to have a table of people that you love and trust so that you can do that and be scared of it. But I really strongly encourage you to be scared and do it anyway, at least a few times, because nothing's going to assuage those fears like finding out firsthand that, oh my God, I didn't break my story. They went to the elemental plane of air, and I still didn't break my dang story.
It's going to feel real good.
Yeah.
Woo. You're amazing, as you know. I just adore you. But I also realized that I'm totally messed up in the beginning of this interview because I was just so excited to talk to you and jump in. I didn't even introduce you properly.
You said my name. I guess people can.
I did, and DM Jazzy Hands, which a lot of people do know you as. But if they don't know who you are, I will properly introduce you as streamer, podcaster, and designer, and also dungeon master and producer of The Last Refuge, a D&D podcast, writer and editor on the DMs Guild, and super exciting that by the time this episode airs next week, people will already have maybe had a chance to see you as the brand new member on Rivals of Waterdeep. Oh,
Yes.
what?
I'm so excited. I really
That's
am.
amazing.
Yeah. I've watched them for 8 seasons now, and I can't wait to get started with them. Of course, by the time you said this comes out, they'll know, but I'm very excited.
Yeah, because, okay, so that, yes. Well, let's probably the easiest way for people to find out about all of these exciting things is to follow you somewhere, or where should people go for more information?
Yeah. Twitter's the best. Anytime I'm going to be live on either my own channel or streaming with other folks, it's going to get tweeted out. And then there are, links to my DM's Guild projects and stuff like that. So I'm DM Jazzy Hands on Twitter. You can follow me there. You can check out my website if you want, eugeniovargas.com. There are some links to like my adventures and other things on there.
Oh, nice.
And also, my career from the before times as a theater artist. I think that's still on the internet somewhere.
Oh, and hopefully we get to see you in that role again sometime.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah.
Fingers crossed. Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you so much for being here and talking to me. This is excellent advice. I am sure other new, inexperienced, and scared dungeon masters will agree. But you have demystified a lot of, actually a huge part of what stands in the way of dungeon mastering for me. So I'm one step closer to getting behind that screen.
We're going to get you there. And reach out, ask me questions, you, Shelly, but also listeners, reach out. I'm happy to chat about DMing. I think my DMs are maybe open on Twitter. I don't know. Send me a tweet. But I love bringing new people into the game. And I will say it is not always easy to DM. And that's, as we give you this advice and give you this confidence, I think it is only fair to say this isn't necessarily always easy, but it's totally worth it, and it's not as hard as you think. So,
and it's harder. What did you say earlier? Harder to screw up your campaigns than you think.
Way harder, ultimately, to screw up your story. As long as you know A and Z, the middle doesn't matter, and you're not going to break much.
Excellent advice. It just keeps pouring out of you. I love it. Okay. Well, thank you so much for being here. And I hope that you have a wonderful time on the Rivals, and we get to see a lot more of you in the future.
Yes, indeed.
Mwah.
Mwah. Talk to you soon.
You're the best. Bye.
Bye.